Hello, it is Thursday, July the 16th, and we continue on our mini Bible series as we prepare for Sunday worship, this seventh Sunday after the Pentecost, July 19, 2020. Today, looking at the gospel and some of my reflections on the gospel. And honestly, it's kind of a tough gospel today because it talks a little bit about Judgment Day. So the gospel is from St. Matthew in the 13th chapter, verses 24 through 30, and then jumping ahead, verses 36 through 43. So let me begin with the introduction to the gospel. Jesus tells a parable about the coexistence of good and evil in this world. God's judgment will remove all evildoers and causes of sin, but not until the end of human history. Jesus put before the crowds another parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to someone who sowed good seed in his field. But while everybody was asleep, an enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat, and then went away. So when the plants came up and bore grain, then the weeds appeared as well. And the slaves of the householder came and said to him, "Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where then did these weeds come from?" He answered, "An enemy has done this." The slaves said to him, "Then do you want us to go and gather them?" But he replied, "No, for in gathering the weeds you would uproot the wheat along with them. Let both of them grow together until the harvest. And at harvest time I will tell the reapers, collect the weeds first and bind them into bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn." Then Jesus left the crowds and went into the house. And his disciples approached him, saying, "Explain to us the parable of the weeds and the field." He answered, "The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Just as the weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all evildoers, and they will throw them into the furnace of fire, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Let anyone with ears listen." As I said, this is kind of a tough gospel. For some, this parable feels empowering, as if there is a promise of vindication against their enemies. For some, this parable invokes feelings of fear, causing them to wonder, how good does one have to be in order to be considered wheat rather than a weed? For some, this parable causes them to wonder, what kind of merciful God would cast the not good enough into eternal torture? Last week's gospel, the parable of the sower, Jesus focused on the harvest that is produced by the seed that fell on the good soil. In contrast, today's parable, or the parable of the weeds, focuses on the judgment that will occur for all causes of sin and all evildoers, in verse 41. At first read, this parable about the weeds appears to describe a them versus us situation, tempting us to decide who are the evildoers, who are the children of the devil, and who are the children of God, we good people, of course. It's an easy trap to fall into for each of us to put ourselves in the good category and look at people that we don't like or people that we disagree with and say, well, there's the bad people. There are the weeds. A closer read, I think, though, when we filter out all of that ego, is going to reveal to us that Jesus is using this parable as an instruction for us, a teaching, as well as I think there are some parts of it that we can look at and feel encouraged. I know that sounds weird. But in the parable, the one who sows the weeds among the wheat is called an enemy. We read about enemies 3 other times in the Gospel of Matthew. And the first time is in chapter 5, verses 43 and 44, which is part of the Sermon on the Mount, where we are told by Jesus, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now this should give us something to think about. If these enemies are destined for a furnace of fire, as it says in verse 42 of today's gospel, why should we love them in the here and now? And further, God, the one who judges all of us, causes the sun to rise on both the evil and the good, without any kind of distinction. So what are we to make about this paradox, this conundrum, this puzzle? The second reference to enemies is in Matthew chapter 10, verse 36. Jesus is telling the disciples that he's sending them out as sheep among wolves. And one's enemies will be members of one's own household. In other words, one's own family. This too should give us something to think about. What does it mean that deep divisions can occur even among those with whom we feel closest? And does this include our church families? What would make us enemies one of another? And in such a situation, those in our own biological family as well as those in our Christian family, how do we know whether we're the enemy, the weed, or the good, the wheat? Who decides? What is it that determines which one I am? Or who is it? The third reference is in Matthew chapter 22, verse 24, where Jesus speaks about the prophecy of David, the king of the Old Testament, with respect to the coming Messiah. And it says in Psalm 110, verse 1, "Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet." Ultimately, the enemies who sow weeds among the wheat will be defeated. They will be tossed out from the presence of God, where they will weep and gnash their teeth. Will this weeping and gnashing of teeth be out of frustration for being called out as weeds, as enemies? Or is this weeping and gnashing of teeth a sign of remorse for what they've done? Is there still a possibility for salvation? Or is the weeping and gnashing of teeth simply a sign of anger at being defeated by their enemy, who is God? Boy, taken together, all of these several different references, they resist any individual's efforts to turn enemies into some nameless opponents on the other side of this great divide that we call them versus us. Rather, this parable may point us towards something even more complex, in which the lines between them and us become blurred, even as we hear about the ultimate defeat of the enemy, whoever that means. The complications increase when we read the language in the explanation of the parable that Jesus gives to the disciples, the verses 36 through 42 of today's gospel. And in Matthew 13, 38, and 39, the enemy who sows the weeds is identified as the devil, or another name, Satan, while the weeds are called children of the evil one. The first appearance of this is in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, or Satan. This is a defining moment in Matthew's gospel in which Jesus has to make a decision. Whom will he serve, the devil or God? The kingdoms of the world or the kingdom of heaven? Jesus faces temptation again in Matthew chapter 16. And that is the part where Peter begins to question the necessity of the crucifixion. And Jesus tells Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." Wow. Jesus says, "You are a stumbling block to me. For you, Peter, are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." The very idea that Jesus must resist temptation is worth our time to think about. So is the realization that Jesus can be tempted by one of his own disciples. The final reference to the devil is found in the conclusion of the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is another Judgment Day parable that many people have difficulty with. It's in Matthew 25. Jesus turns to the goats, who then wonder, "When, Lord? When did we see you naked or thirsty or in prison or in the appearance of a stranger?" and condemns them to the eternal fires prepared for the devil and his children. The goats had thought that they were followers of Jesus. But Jesus says their actions, or lack thereof, show them to be children of the evil one. Talk about blurry lines. This is getting so very confusing. One would think that the difference between wheat and weeds would be obvious. In the parable, the workers of the field noticed the difference right away. So why does the householder delay? Is it because we, the servants, are too hasty to pass judgment on which is which or who is which? Or because we really are not in a position to pass judgment on anyone? Or is there because there's only one God, like Isaiah told us in the first reading? Or is it to extend God's grace for just a little while longer, hoping for the best in everyone? Or maybe, as I would like us to think about it, is it to allow each one of us time to reflect on whether we, each one of us, have been wheat or weeds? In the end, says the parable, Judgment Day will come when wheat and weeds are separated. Does that make us uncomfortable? Or does it fill us with hope? Or maybe just a little bit of both. Whenever a person does feel like they are not receiving what they deserve, it can lead to a rage that burns like a furnace within the person. It can cause that person to wither up inside and cease to bear fruit on the outside. It can even lead a person to become a bitter enemy of one another and of God. In the end, judgment is necessary and important work, although the work, as I see it, is for each of us to take a deeper look into ourselves and how we are living out our own resurrection life. Judgment is not ours to do to other people. And judgment should never lead us to some kind of self-satisfaction or self-righteousness. The question that this parable leads us to, in my humble opinion, is which we are. Which one are each one of us? Are we wheat or are we weeds? And only we get to decide that for now. Rather than trying to decide what other people are, let's focus this on ourselves. Deciding what other people are, that responsibility belongs to God. And there's only one God. I think we should thank God that there's only one God. Because I'm sure I do not want any other human beings deciding whether I am wheat or weeds. Thank you for joining me today and for all of this week as we look at the readings for this upcoming Sunday, the 7th Sunday after Pentecost, July 19th, 2020. Have a great day, and God bless.